morning, folks. We're so glad you jumped online with us this morning to just be together. Excited to share some time with you a bit later on Zoom if you have that opportunity. We'd love to just catch up with you a little bit, spend some time in prayer together, and see your face. It's been another one of those weeks, and I'm looking forward to just sharing that space with you all. So I hope you're doing well. I do want to remind you that we continue to have our weekly mobile food bank. You can join us at 2 o'clock for volunteers over at Greenville High School tomorrow, and then join us even that following Monday. We are making plans to keep this going as long as the need remains, and right now we have seen our numbers stay quite high, and so we want to make sure we're meeting needs here in our community. Also, just want to give that shout out that we really appreciate all the help that we're receiving with volunteers and working the parking lot over there from City Church here in Greenville, and I know we even have Pastor Sarah from the Nazarene Church and Pastor Paul from the Shiloh site here in Greenville. Just been a great time of fellowship at a distance with our masks on, but we're enjoying that. So we'd certainly invite you, if you have some chance, to come participate with us. If you're feeling healthy, you haven't been sick, if you're not feeling in a vulnerable age at all on that, we'd love to have you come be part of that. We appreciate that. So we are going to continue to sing, though, as we're together this morning. So a couple familiar songs for us this morning. Worthy of all the praise we could ever do. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever serve. Worthy of every breath we could ever do. We live for you. We live for you. And holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes and wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to knows all around. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes and wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes and wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love towards Your love, reaches to the heavens. Your faithfulness stretches to the sky. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountain. Your justice flows like the ocean's tide. I will lift my voice to worship you, my and I will find my strength in the shadow of your wings. Your love, oh Lord, reaches to the heavens. Your faithfulness stretches to the sky. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your justice flows like the ocean's tide. I will lift my voice to worship you, my King. And I will find my strength in the shadow of your wings. And I will lift my voice to worship you, my King. And I will find my strength in the shadow of your wings. Your love, oh Lord, reaches to the heavens. Your faithfulness stretches to the sky. Here at First Church of God, we're able to do some really fun youth group trips. And two of my favorites that we have annually or every other year are our state youth convention and our international youth convention. And I bring these up because when you're going on these trips, we stay at these really nice hotels. And so part of that, when you're with a bunch of young people, students, you have to lay out some rules. And most of our rules are actually good things. Usually the top one is we talk about having fun. And as you probably know, if you're sitting with one of your students right there with you, we're good at having fun. I think we always accomplish that rule. And the other one I always joke about is that no injuries are allowed on these trips. And so far, we've been really fortunate to not have any major injuries, even though we had one student actually fall down some steps at our last IYC, but we won't name names this morning. But, the other big piece of this is we allow some free time for the students to explore and have some freedom. And so they're able to leave their rooms during free time. And my biggest requirement for them is that they be in groups of 3 at all times. And we've been fortunate that no one really has pushed back too much on that, but there is this basic questioning of, do you really mean this at all times? And maybe you recognize that with your own growing up experience or your student at home, that we're always kind of pushing against that. What is the base list? What can I really get away with? And right now we're experiencing that a bit also as we go through this quarantine time, the stay home, stay safe that just recently got extended a little further here into May. Even though some things have been slightly lessened a little bit and there's a little more freedoms, we're wrestling with that gray area of what is necessary travel, what's not. Who is an essential worker, who is not. What is essential business or not. We've been dealing with that until just recently now with landscaping and people that are builders, our recreational activities. What is allowed, what's not. And that's that questioning, right? We always want to know, did you really mean that? What is the base list? Last week, we talked about true embodiment is living the way of Jesus with intellect and emotion. And today and going forward here as we move through a new series that we're beginning, we're going to call that head and heart. Because this is the foundation of how we love others well, loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. It always involves a head and heart connection. And there is a need for tough-minded and tender-hearted believers. Okay? It's not this either or, it's both and. And Jesus might say it this way, and he actually does. In Matthew 10:16, he says, be as cunning, or maybe it's as crafty or as sharp as a snake. And then he also says, and be as harmless or innocent or inoffensive as doves. And if you think about that, it's actually pretty difficult to imagine a person having these characteristics simultaneously. Yet, this is what Jesus teaches. It's living the best way, the full and free life that we most deeply desire, which is found in the true source of Jesus, is often this creative combination of perceived opposites that come together and they work in wonderful coordination. We need to be tough-minded at times when we experience emotional dryness. There hasn't been a lot of heart and feel going on in our experience as we are Christians. And then we also need that tender heart to keep us moving forward when our intellect, our mind just can't be satisfied and we have to just embrace mysteries, what we would call have faith and keep trusting. Now this is a bit of a foundational week here as we gather around this message this morning. It's going to be a look at our base as a community that is living the way of Jesus. And this morning I want to introduce 2 bedrocks of living in God's kingdom, and they are justice and forgiveness. Now, oftentimes these kind of present as opposites. However, as we've just discussed, they should work together in harmony. These are foundational characteristics of the life of a Christian, or at least they need to be. And however, though, we accept that these are messy topics, and you see our messy title slide right here. In most times, as we wrestle with that messiness, we are bent toward upholding one or the other. Again, that Christian dualism that we've talked about in past weeks. But we have to understand it is really both and. We don't have to uphold one or the other. Because if we're honest this morning, wouldn't most of us admit that when it comes to matters of life with other messy people and wrongdoings, or what we might call sin, we want forgiveness for ourselves, but we want cold, hard justice for the other people. Yet, it is God's command for us to love our neighbors as ourselves. So this is where we're heading this morning, together today. And I would like to go to the original foundations of God's people and head all the way back into the book of Leviticus. Now here we are going to encounter the first mention of love your neighbor as yourself in Scripture. And in order to give you a little bit broader context, we're going to read a few of the verses leading up to that first original statement. So you can tune in with us here on the screen, or you can turn in your Bible at home to Leviticus chapter 19. We're going to be starting at verse 11. Leviticus 19, verse 11, starting there, going through 18. It says this: "Do not steal. Do not deceive or cheat one another. Do not bring shame on the name of your God by using it to swear falsely. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not make your hired workers wait until the next day to receive their pay. Do not insult the deaf or cause the blind to stumble. You must fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not twist justice in legal matters by favoring the poor or being partial to the rich and powerful. Always judge people fairly. Do not spread slanderous gossip among your people. Do not stand idly by when your neighbor's life is threatened. I am the Lord. Do not nurse hatred in your heart for any of your relatives. Confront people directly so that you will not be held guilty for their sin. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." The command to love your neighbor as yourself is the conclusive general statement at the end of what we would call a series of community justice commands in this particular chapter in Leviticus. This is an expression of God's love for His people and a command to instruct them in how to live in harmony as His community. Now keep in mind that this is His chosen group to represent God to the world, to all of those around them. The people He called and He rescued out of Egypt and out of slavery. A people group that He has richly blessed, a community that He has promised blessing to over and over, and He has delivered on it. And they still need reminding of how to live the best way, how to live God's way. They need reminding of that base list, which, if you might have noticed, included some of what we'd call the 10 Commandments. Now this morning I want to talk about justice, and to get us started on here, I want to offer you a pretty easy to take with you definition of justice. And so how I would simply define that is, justice is making things right for everyone. It is righting the wrongs. And that sounds good, right? I mean, who could be against justice? I mean, certainly one of the things that the laws and the prophets and Jesus all agree on is justice for all, regardless of background and social status. And I would take it a step further and say that Christian justice is this. It should be defined as action and movement for equal regard of all people. This means that we value every person in the same way, regardless of their traits, their talents, their actions, or what they can do for us. And I'm not one, and you've probably caught on to this, to go to the original language as a teaching point very often. But I want us to get these foundational truths correct as we do begin this series. So let's look at some original Hebrew this morning. And you're going to have to bear with me because I didn't study Hebrew in detail, and so my Hebrew accent is just not there in my enunciation. But these are the two main words that we find for justice that are found in the Hebrew language. And we're going to start with this first one, is tzedakah. And this specifically means delivering justice, a community restoring justice. It is the act of being just and being righteous. Now, this is stuff that would be familiar to us here at First Church of God because this looks like building ramps for handicapped folks. We've done that. It looks like feeding the hungry and the elderly around us. We've participated in that. It could also look like establishing nonprofits to help meet basic needs of residents in our towns. And I'm so grateful for places like that in our space. I think of Have Mercy and just the work they're doing. The second Hebrew word for justice is mishpat. And this one means judgment according to right or rights. It means punishing wrongdoers and caring for the victims of unjust treatment. And this is familiar to us. This would be, it looks like prosecuting citizens that exploit or swindle vulnerable people. I mean, we've seen things like this in the past with predatory lending practices and different Ponzi schemes and things that are just taking advantage of the vulnerable. Now, I bring these up because oftentimes these specific words that we just looked at in Hebrew are translated into our English Bibles not as justice, but as righteousness and or judgment. And then these words become regarded as something more like private or personal morality, moral perfection, or holiness. And even times it creates an image of judgment that only looks like divine retribution. However, these original words we just looked at offer us a much more accurate definition that reflects that head and that heart-centered approach. It's head because we are making judgments that are according to God's ways and design. And it's judgment based on the rights of each human for well-being, punishing the wrongdoer and upholding the victims of injustice. Okay, that's a head thing. And then that's heart because it is looking at the rights of an entire community, and especially considering those who are without power and are the most vulnerable. It's the work of delivering justice to the community by actually embodying righteous living. True justice includes both the punishment for wrongdoing and community ethics. This is the work of the heart and of the head. It's holding the balance and the tension between what we would call individual rights and then the rights of community. Now I want to jump back into our main text that we already read out of Leviticus, and I want to go back to verses 17 and 18 because this is where we first encounter this call to love your neighbor as yourself. And in 17 it specifically says, "Do not nurse hatred in your heart for any of your relatives. Confront people directly so that you will not be held guilty for their sin." And 18 goes on, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself." Now in verse 17, we are given the command to confront people directly. This was a command to the Israelites to call a sin, to call wrongdoing what it is. For us, we would call that an opportunity to speak the truth. Many Christians would say it that way. And all the while, if you go into verse 18, they must refuse to seek their own revenge or hold a grudge against the offending party. Then further on in 18 is where we find that command to love your neighbor as yourself. Now bear with me one more time as we look at one more Hebrew word this morning. And I believe this gives us a good insight here. In verse 18, the word that is translated to read love in our English Bible is the word ahab. And this Hebrew word implies an ardent and passionate inclination of the mind and a tenderness of affection at the same time. In other words, the command to love your neighbor as yourself takes a tough mind and it takes a tender heart. It takes an approach to community justice that is founded in both the head and in the heart. This is the tension in which we live if we are to approach the making of things right for everyone, righting the wrongs, within a scriptural framework. It is always found in that head and heart connection working together in harmony. But I admit, and you probably feel the same way, that it feels mostly like tension and a really uncomfortable place to be because it is messy and it is a bit untidy. But this is the basic idea here that Oswald Chambers shares in one of his My Utmost for His Highest devotional. And he says this, he says, "Never look for your own justice in this world, but never cease to give it. If we look for our own justice, we will only begin to complain and to indulge ourselves in the discontent of self-pity." I think we can all recognize some truth here. But this is indeed a really tough thing to do. And let me provide just a few words that I'm personally working on in regards to this very thing. I find that when I'm clamoring for my own justice, when I haven't really actually experienced real injustice, maybe it's just a little shot at my privilege and the things that I've got going for me. When I express this and I begin to want my own justice, this comes off to my neighbors, the ones who've actually maybe really experienced injustice in their life. It comes off as hurtful and insincere and really dismissive of them. And this isn't the way that we would love our neighbors as ourselves. This isn't demonstrating to them that they're actually heard, that they are valued, that they are secure, to be real and honest within our communities and with me. You know, the hope and the goal of community justice lived out with both a tough mind and that tender heart is that no one would have to suffer through injustice at our hands. And I know it sounds really grandiose, it seems too good to be true, but as we've already looked at, the expectation of living the embodied way of Jesus calls us to this very task. And here's why. You'll see it right here on the screen. How we interact with the world and how we love our neighbor says everything about how much we love God and what we believe about Him. Now, I told you we were going to talk about two things, and so that's justice a bit. We'll come back at the end a little bit to that, but I want to look at forgiveness, and we're going to go to the New Testament to hear into the Sermon on the Mount. And if you're familiar with that text, you already know where you're turning. We're going to be in Matthew 5. And this is Jesus talking. And the Sermon on the Mount is so powerful because so much of what Jesus is setting up in this one teaching plays into all of His ministry and all of the teachings that come later. This was the pinnacle moment of Jesus laying the groundwork of what it means about the kingdom of God here and now and a future reality. So Matthew 5, we're going to specifically be verse 23 and 24, and you'll see it here on the screen too. It says this, and this is Jesus speaking. So if you are presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person. Then come and offer your sacrifice to God. I want to give you a definition here just to work from when I think of forgiveness. And forgiveness is this: it is intentional decision to release feelings of resentment or vengeance toward a person or a group who has harmed you, regardless of whether they actually deserve your forgiveness. I want to tag on to that. It doesn't mean excusing or condoning offenses. So here in our text in Matthew that we just read, Jesus is turning some things upside down, or maybe it's actually right side up, compared to the way that most devout religious folks have lived their lives of worship. Andy Stanley would call this, he's going to go from a vertical morality, which is eye to the sky, me and God, it's all about this relationship, to more of a horizontal morality, which includes loving your neighbor. Now here in this text, the issue is forgiveness, and the context is the community of God's people. It is also important to notice that the command is given to the one who has done the offending, not the offended party. So what are you to do? You are to go and be reconciled with this person. To reconcile means to make peace. So in other words, Jesus is commanding His followers, especially when they have offended others, to take it upon themselves to initiate the recovery of peaceful relationships. Always be seeking to establish justice, making things right for everyone, righting the wrongs. I mean, that surely will raise some eyebrows. And Jesus says that even if you are doing something very important, like worshiping God through sacrifice and offering, you must step away and give attention to something even more important, which is seeking forgiveness. This would have been shocking to His first hearers, and I have a feeling that it's still a little bit shocking to us. Because if you were honest, your first thought would be to postpone that whole seeking forgiveness thing and give attention to the
the worship. But Jesus flips this over and he reorders the steps in accordance to what he prioritizes. And Jesus prioritizes forgiveness. Jesus seems to be saying that other religious works, however good they may be, are not acceptable before God if you are going to ignore conflict with or personal sin against your brothers and your sisters. I mean, can you expect God to be pleased with your worship when your hearts and your hands are filthy with injustice against your neighbors? If you are honest, and you will admit it, forgiveness is really difficult. It's truly one of those things that is easier said than done. And it is uncomfortable to humble yourself and seek someone's forgiveness because in order to do so, it will cost you your pride and your comfort will be surrendered. You have to admit that you have caused a problem, that you are the wrongdoer, and you have to own that injustice by seeking forgiveness. In short, forgiveness is essential. It is a foundational truth in the way of Jesus. It is on the base list. Now, another truth here for this morning as we begin to kind of put this together. The truth is reconciliation takes two people, but to offer forgiveness only takes one. We don't get to control reconciliation. We don't get to force it to happen. And there's a chance that as you seek forgiveness, that you unfortunately may not receive back true peace through reconciliation. Reconciliation is the final step in the forgiveness process. It is that cherry on top. It's the extra bonus if it happens. But why wouldn't someone extend you forgiveness if you are seeking it from them? Why wouldn't you extend forgiveness if someone is seeking it from you? Is it the fear that if we don't hold offenders accountable, that they will get away with something? Is it our view of justice demands that we make them pay for their transgressions? I mean, we can't just let people off the hook for what they've done, or they're just going to do it all over again. Anger and bitterness are the dangers of clinging too tightly to that demand for justice and refusing to seek or give forgiveness. And these two dangers, they prevent us from ever moving forward and offering future forgiveness to the others and seeking it for ourselves. The truth is, anger and bitterness are blinding forces in our communities and in ourselves, which leads us to a despair-inducing self-pity as we demand justice in our world for our own selves in order to protect our ego and our pride. Because when we want justice and then we hold on to unforgiveness or are unwilling to seek forgiveness, we become vigilantes and punishers. Now, it is important right here that I pause for a second and give this caveat. We as humans are not meant to be harmed in the multitude of physical and mental and emotional ways that evil in this world has affected us. It is not compassionate to insist that victims just hurry up and forgive the perpetrator of their immense pain. And I believe that our mental health professionals can truly speak to this challenge of forgiveness. And one such expert is Donna White. And she would remind us that we cannot change the past, and we also cannot change people. With this in mind, it is important to remember that what forgiveness is actually all about. Forgiveness is not about erasing the past, because that past can't be erased. It is not simply forgetting what has happened. Sometimes it's beneficial actually to remember the pain so that we don't go through that same thing again. It is not about making someone else see their faults or expecting your forgiveness to change their behaviors. Forgiveness instead is about giving a person the power to accept the situation for what it is or what it was. It's that letting go. It's that moving past anger and pain and bitterness and moving into a better and healthier place. And Donna White gives us some really good steps, and these would be some good actionable steps if you're dealing with forgiveness, whether you need to seek it or whether you need to accept it. Her first one says that we need to look at our role in the situation. The second is that we have to have some empathy for the hurt that the other person must have been affected by for bringing such hurt into our life. It's the whole hurt people hurt people. The third, she says, remember that you have the power and you are in control of yourself. Yeah. The next, she says, we have to make a commitment to move on. Her fifth suggestion is that we let go of the past. And the one that tags with that, her last one, is that we wish the ones who hurt us well. Now, this is a real challenge here. Before we talk about justice as we wrap up, I want to just show you a picture, just give you a little bit of an illustration of what we're talking about here. Is that at any time we don't just live in a vacuum. There's a spectrum of when we've either been hurt or maybe we fall into the punisher side of this. But either way, there's a need for granting some forgiveness maybe and working back towards a middle ground, or seeking forgiveness and again, working towards justice for everyone. And this is really Jesus' example. This is his ideal of loving neighbor as self. And so you might fall in a different spot. And it's weird how different interactions and different relationships put us in different spots on this little number line. And we're going to revisit this as we walk through this series, as we add a few more bits and pieces to this. But I do acknowledge that this doesn't just happen nice, clean, and tidy. It is indeed messy stuff. So how to participate in justice, and specifically community justice that we've been talking about this morning. What are some actionable steps there? And I want to encourage you, when it comes to justice, we actually have to do it. There has to be the want to care. And I believe that proximity is key for this to happen. And think about the things we do here just at First Church, just here. And we always are talking about mission trips, and we show you pictures of these trips, and we try to convince you that, when you're up close and personal on these trips, whether it's just to Kentucky and keeping it kind of a little more local, or maybe it is going all the way to Belize or Guatemala. But when you see that up close and personal, you can't help but have a heart connection, an experience with these people. And you want to help. You want to be involved. I think the same thing at the food truck. It's such an up close and personal proximity thing. And right now we're doing it weekly. And the bummer is everyone stays in their vehicles and we're doing a good job of practicing social distance. But we don't get the same interaction. Floyd and I were talking about that it's not quite the same. But it's still meeting needs. But I love it when we do the food truck here on our property and you get to come up beside someone and strike up a conversation. And I have a few people I seek out each month because I just want to have a conversation with them. And you take their basket from them. And you go around the tables and you load up this basket. And you're talking, you're just listening. You're hearing their story of how their life's been the last month. And you're carrying their 80 pounds of food. And you take it to their car and you wish them well as they go on. You look them in the eye and you listen to them. And you hear them and you see the value of them is just because they're a human. Developing empathy by looking for the marginalized and the vulnerable. And listening to them and allowing them to share their perspectives and their experiences. And I want to remind you that justice is a who. It is not what. Justice is an ethic of empathy. This is how we actually exercise that heart muscle that is responsible for loving others. And I hope it is clear from this base list message, this foundational message, that justice and forgiveness are part of our journey. And we cannot simply ignore our own pain and the pain of others and just hope that over time it will all diminish. The work of justice and forgiveness is absolutely vital to our entire health and our freedom as human beings to love our neighbor as ourselves. I really thank you for joining us here on YouTube again this morning. We're going to hop on to Zoom here just in a matter of minutes and have a little space for some talk-back time. Hopefully you've seen the questions that I emailed out or the questions that are posted in this YouTube comment section. Also, you have maybe noticed that there's some additional information. This article from Donna White that had the steps to working through forgiveness and maybe some other elements there. I want to provide you with resources as we step through this series together. Thanks for tuning in. We'll join you here in just moments on Zoom. Thank you.